You're 15, maybe 16, and the first thing you understand is that the danger isn't inside your body, it's outside your front door. The moment someone suspects, your life stops being a life and becomes a situation, managed in whispers and closed curtains. Your mother's voice changes, not louder, just tighter, as if even the air might carry the news to the neighbors. A teacher avoids your eyes, then suddenly wants to see you after class, and you can feel the corridor watching even when no one is looking. Someone says you look tired, someone says you've been off, and then, without any dramatic announcement, the world begins to rearrange itself around one idea: make sure nobody sees. Because in respectable Britain, for a long time, pregnancy outside marriage was treated less like a public health issue and more like a social contamination event, a moral flare that had to be smothered before it sparked questions. That's how moral panic works when it wears a polite face. It doesn't always shout, it organizes, it moves people quietly. It turns families into small governments, schools into compliance machines, and institutions into clean rooms where inconvenient truths can be sealed away. After the war, Britain rebuilt its streets and promised itself a better future, but it also rebuilt an older order of shame, especially around girls. The country could modernize on paper while preserving an ancient logic in practice. Women and girls carried the burden of virtue, and when virtue was broken, the priority became containment, not care. The language used around these cases rarely sounded cruel. In fact, much of it sounded protective. People spoke of what's best, a fresh start, keeping things private, saving her future. Privacy is a real good, a necessary good, and in other contexts, it protects people. But privacy can become a weapon when it is forced, when it exists to protect reputation rather than a person, when it becomes the excuse that stops anyone from asking whether the situation is humane. And once shame becomes a community's shared priority, the girl at the center of it becomes something more than a person. She becomes a risk to manage. She becomes a secret that must not leak. She becomes, in effect, a state secret, not in the cinematic sense of spies and classified stamps, but in the practical sense of a system closing ranks so the public story stays clean. The pathway often began with the smallest authorities, the ones closest to your daily life. A parent who cannot bear humiliation, a head teacher worried about the school's name, a GP who speaks with quiet certainty, offering options as if laying out a map, when in truth, the road has already been decided by fear. Sometimes a priest or minister, gentle and sincere, framing repentance as a route back to normality. Sometimes a social worker who believes she is helping because she has been trained to see outcomes, not inner damage. None of these people need to hate you for the machine to work. The machine runs on embarrassment, on social pressure, on the idea that a girl's mistake must be neatly corrected. That's why the first step is often removal, not because you are dangerous, but because you are visible. You are taken out of school under euphemisms that protect the institution: illness, family matters, going away for a while. Your friends are given a simple story because complicated truth invites questions, and questions are the enemy of reputation. Once you are out of sight, you become easier to reshape. The next step is containment. You might be sent to an aunt in another county, where your days are made small and quiet, where your phone calls are watched, where your returning home is treated like a privilege you must earn. Or you might be placed in a home or hostel that looks ordinary from the street and feels institutional on the inside, where routines are strict and framed as discipline, where your time is filled so you have less time to think, where your compliance is praised as maturity. In those places you learn a new vocabulary, the vocabulary of systems that want obedience without calling it obedience. You are not hidden, you are protected. You are not isolated, you are given peace. You are not pressured, you are supported. The words matter because they keep the conscience clean for everyone involved. They allow adults to believe they are being decent while they tighten control around you. And then comes the central decision, the one that a moral panic prefers to treat as the only decision because it produces the cleanest outcome for everyone else: separation and silence. Adoption may be chosen freely in some circumstances, and it can be loving, but under moral panic it becomes less a choice and more a funnel, because the world around you is designed to make only one path seem responsible. The framing is relentless. The baby will have a better life. You are too young. You must think of your future. You must not ruin your family. You must not destroy your chances. You must not become that girl. What's happening underneath that framing is rarely acknowledged. You are being taught that your grief is an inconvenience. You are being trained to see your own attachment as childish. You are being coached, in effect, to treat the most intense bond you have ever felt as something you should hand over neatly, quickly, gratefully. This is where the system becomes brutal without becoming graphic. It doesn't need physical violence to break a person. It uses fear, dependency, and isolation. It places you in environments where your opinion is always balanced against a chorus of adult authority. It times the pressure, so it arrives when you're exhausted, frightened, and hungry for any promise of relief. And it surrounds you with an implied threat that doesn't have to be spoken. Resist, and you will be alone. Resist, and you will be judged. Resist, and you will make it worse, not only for yourself but for everyone you love. A moral panic turns personal pain into a communal project. The community becomes a silent participant. Neighbors don't need to do anything. Their imagined gaze is enough. Institutions don't need to coordinate. They only need to share the same instinct for containment. That's how an ordinary country created extraordinary silence around pregnant teenagers. The secret wasn't only your pregnancy. The secret was what the system was willing to do to keep itself comfortable. When the birth comes, it is often handled with an efficiency that feels like a second erasure. You are moved through rooms as if you are paperwork in human form. Some staff are kind, some are curt, but the structure itself is indifferent. Indifference is the real horror here, the way something life-changing can be processed like routine. In many accounts, the most haunting detail is how quickly the world expects you to detach, as if separation is a medical procedure rather than an emotional amputation. You may be advised not to see the baby, not to hold the baby, not to name the baby, because naming makes the baby real, and reality makes secrecy harder. And secrecy is the point, because once the baby is real in the public story, the world has to admit a moral order can fail, and the world does not like admitting failure when it has invested so much in the appearance of virtue. So the record becomes controlled, the narrative becomes smoothed, the home receives a version of events designed to end the matter. And then you return, sometimes within weeks, expected to walk back into normal life as though you were merely away. You sit at the same kitchen table while your family speaks around a gap in the room, a gap shaped like the truth. You go back to school or to work under the weight of what cannot be spoken. You learn to laugh at the right moments because not laughing invites questions. You learn to keep your eyes dry because tears make people uncomfortable, and discomfort threatens the fragile peace your disappearance has brought. This is how moral panic turns pregnant teenagers into state secrets. Not through one dramatic act, but through a chain of small acts, each justified as sensible, each adding another layer of concealment until the girl's real life becomes something that exists only in her mind and in whatever locked files the system decides she should never see. The real cruelty is that the secrecy doesn't end when the pregnancy ends. It becomes a lifelong climate. It shapes identity, memory, trust. It teaches a person that the most important thing they ever lived through must be kept invisible, because invisibility is the price of being allowed back into respectable society. And once a society learns it can solve an uncomfortable problem by hiding it, it starts reaching for the same solution again and again, each time calling it discretion, each time claiming it is kindness, each time leaving another person to carry the cost in private. When you live inside a secret long enough, you start to feel that the world outside has agreed to pretend you were never there, and that agreement becomes a second kind of confinement. Britain's concealment of unmarried pregnancy wasn't one neat policy you can blame and file away. It was an ecosystem where law, religion, class, bureaucracy, and fear reinforced each other so seamlessly that everyone could insist they were acting sensibly. The country had institutions that sincerely believed they were preserving order, protecting girls, and preventing harm. Yet the same machinery could still produce outcomes that felt like a quiet disappearance. What made it powerful was how ordinary it looked from the outside. A teenage pregnancy wasn't handled like a crisis that demanded openness and support. It was handled like a reputational emergency that demanded control. Control of who knew, control of what was written down, control of what the girl was allowed to think about herself. In that ecosystem, help often arrived as a set of instructions designed to keep things tidy. A school might frame your exit as temporary illness because illness is socially forgivable in a way that scandal isn't. A GP might recommend a home because it keeps you fed, supervised, and off the street, but also because it keeps you out of sight. A parent might accept that recommendation because they are terrified of what the neighbors will do with the story, and because they have been taught, quietly and for years, that reputation is a form of survival. In many households, the fear wasn't abstract. It was practical. Losing work, losing standing, losing church community, losing marriage prospects for other siblings, being treated like a family that failed. Shame, in that sense, functioned like a local tax, and the quickest way to pay it was to remove the evidence. Once removed, the girl's absence could be filled with a story the community preferred. People are surprisingly willing to accept simple explanations if simple explanations spare them discomfort. She's gone to help a relative. She's unwell. She's working away. Those lines are not dramatic lies, they're social anesthetic. They numb the questions that would force everyone to confront what is being done in the name of respectability. Inside the system, the girl learns how easily her own narrative can be overwritten. The adults around her speak in the language of inevitability, and inevitability is the most effective form of persuasion because it makes resistance feel childish. If you are told repeatedly that there is only one responsible option, you begin to confuse coercion with maturity. The system also benefits from timing. It arrives when you are most vulnerable, when morning sickness and fear have already stripped your confidence, when you are dependent on adults for housing, transport, money, and permission. Even when professionals behave kindly, the structural imbalance remains. The girl is the client, the case, the problem to be solved, while the institution is the solver, the authority, the voice that will be believed. That imbalance shows up in small things that accumulate into a personality change. Who reads your letters? Who decides whether you can keep a photograph? Who answers questions about your options with a sigh that implies you're being difficult? Who praises you for being brave when bravery is actually obedience? Who warns you not to get attached to the baby, as if attachment is a childish indulgence rather than a human reflex? If you are given counseling, it may be shaped toward acceptance rather than exploration, because acceptance produces the cleanest outcome. The cleanest outcome socially is a baby who can be placed and a girl who can return to normal life as if nothing happened. That is the lie at the center, the idea that a person can return unchanged after being forced to cut a living chapter out of her own story. The secrecy deepens after the birth because secrecy is what makes the system sustainable. Records are handled carefully, sometimes sealed, sometimes scattered, sometimes recorded in ways that prioritize discretion over traceability. The girl's name might be altered, the baby's name might be changed quickly, The language in files may reduce emotion to symptoms and trauma to adjustment. Everyone involved can tell themselves that less information means less pain, but less information also means less accountability. It means that years later, when someone asks what happened, the answer can be softened into fog, and fog protects institutions better than any lock. For many women, the most enduring burden wasn't only the loss itself, it was the enforced silence around the loss. Silence has a way of turning grief inward until it becomes shame, and shame has a way of rewriting memory. If no one will acknowledge what happened, you start to question whether it really happened the way you remember. If everyone insists you should be grateful, you begin to feel guilty for being wounded. If the world calls it a fresh start, you begin to feel broken for not feeling fresh. That is how a moral panic polices not only behavior, but inner life. It teaches the girl to mistrust her own instincts because her instincts don't align with the tidy story the community wants. Over time, that mistrust becomes a personality. It can surface as chronic apology, as hypervigilance, as an inability to take up space, as a terror of being judged for ordinary needs. It can also surface as rage, but rage is harder to express when you have been trained from the first moment that making anyone uncomfortable is dangerous. Some women carried the secret into marriages and never spoke of it, not because they didn't remember, but because the old fear still lived in their bodies, the fear that truth would cost them love. Others tried to search later and met a wall made of procedures, missing documents, closed doors, and polite refusals. The cruelty of that wall is its politeness. Politeness makes it harder to name harm. It's easier to fight a villain than a receptionist reciting policy. It's easier to protest obvious brutality than it is to protest a calm explanation that the file is sealed for privacy. Privacy, again, doing double duty, protecting someone, but also protecting a system from being questioned. This is why these stories feel so modern to viewers, even when the clothes and buildings are old. The mechanism is recognizable. A society labels a group as morally dangerous, then builds a network of solutions that remove that group from view, and finally writes the removal as kindness. The panic does not need everyone to be cruel. It only needs enough people to comply and enough people to look away. It also draws energy from class. Respectability has always hit harder when you have something to lose, and class means different kinds of loss. A wealthy family could sometimes conceal more effectively, pay for discretion, arrange care that was comfortable and private. A poor girl could be processed more openly by institutions because the poor were always easier to manage in public, easier to judge, easier to catalogue. But across class, the common thread was the same learned message. Your pregnancy is not primarily yours. It belongs to the moral order. Keep the secret, and you may be allowed back in. Break the secret, and you may be marked forever. That's the bargain moral panics offer, and it's why they persist. They promise social peace in exchange for personal silence. They promise order in exchange for a person's right to tell the truth about her own life. And once you see how the bargain works, you realize why the story keeps reaching millions, because people sense that the line between respectable help and respectable control is thinner than they want to believe. The question the viewer carries, even if they never say it aloud, is not only what happened to those girls. It's whether a modern system, with new language and updated buildings, could still decide that certain people are easier to manage as secrets than as human beings. The final layer of this story, the part that makes it feel less like an accident and more like a designed outcome, is how easily silence becomes a cultural skill, taught and rewarded until it feels like good manners. In those decades, whole neighborhoods learned to treat secrecy as virtue. If a family concealed the pregnancy, they were handling it. If a girl vanished without explanation, people accepted it because acceptance kept life comfortable. And comfort, in a moral panic, is treated as proof that the system is working. The panic didn't need everyone to be cruel. It only needed people to cooperate with the same small instinct. Don't look too closely. That instinct showed up everywhere. In the school's careful phrasing, in the clinic's paperwork, in the priest's gentle counsel that focused on forgiveness but often skipped justice, in the press that could paint young mothers as symbols of social decay rather than children in trouble, in the casual jokes, the moral lectures, the stories adults told each other at dinner tables about girls these days, as if a teenager's pregnancy were proof of personal rot rather than a complex mix of vulnerability, coercion, ignorance, loneliness, and the absence of safe support. What viewers recognize, even if they can't name it, is that this wasn't only about religion or stern parents. It was a social technology. It took a human situation and turned it into an administrative category, and once something becomes a category, it can be handled with procedure rather than empathy. Procedure is clean. Procedure has no tears. Procedure doesn't sit with you at 3 a.m. Procedure doesn't feel the ache of what you've been told to deny. Procedure simply moves you along. The girl becomes a case. The baby becomes an outcome, and the community becomes protected. When people say later that everyone thought they were doing the right thing, that sentence is not comforting. It's terrifying because it reveals something about how harm spreads. It spreads through reasonable steps. Each step makes sense in isolation. Keep her away from gossip. Give her somewhere to stay. Help her avoid stigma. Find the baby a stable home. Protect confidentiality. Move on. The brutality is not in any single step. It's in the chain. The way the chain tightens until your own life no longer belongs to you. And the chain has a particular talent. It makes you complicit in your own erasure. It teaches you to repeat the system's preferred storyline until you begin to believe it. It teaches you to say, "I'm fine, it was for the best, I'm grateful," as if gratitude can replace grief. It teaches you to speak about yourself like a problem that was corrected. When you resist, the system rarely meets you with open rage. It meets you with disappointment and concern. It treats your resistance as evidence you are not ready to decide. It frames your attachment as instability. That framing matters because it turns your humanity into a symptom. Once your humanity is a symptom, the system can treat control as treatment. And if you're young, dependent, frightened, and isolated, you may end up accepting the frame simply to survive the day. There is also the quiet role of records, the way paper can become a second prison. A culture of secrecy encouraged files that were difficult to trace, names that changed quickly, information handled with discretion so deep it became disappearance. Later in life, when women tried to understand what happened, they often found barriers that sounded neutral but felt punishing. Policies about confidentiality, sealed records, missing details, institutional memory that had evaporated behind polite language. Even when the intent was privacy, the effect could be lifelong uncertainty, a sense that the past was being actively kept from you, not for your benefit, but for the comfort of the system that created it. That uncertainty does something to a person. It keeps grief unresolved, suspended in a place where it can't be honored properly. It can distort relationships because you're carrying a truth that never gets daylight. It can change your sense of time because a part of you remains stuck in the months when you were taught to be invisible. And it can change how you see authority forever because you learned early that authority can speak softly while it takes something irreplaceable. The public often imagines moral panics as sudden waves of shouting, but the longer-lasting kind are quieter. They set the rules of what can be said. They decide which stories count as respectable conversation and which stories must be disposed of. Pregnant teenagers became state secrets because the nation's self-image depended on their silence. A country that wanted to see itself as decent and orderly could not tolerate the visible evidence that its girls were vulnerable, that its men could exploit, that its families could fracture, that its institutions could prioritize reputation over care. So the evidence was hidden. The hiding became normal. And normality, once established, becomes hard to challenge because it requires people to admit that the comfort they enjoyed had a cost paid by someone else. That's why these stories, when told plainly, reach people so hard. They aren't only hearing about the past, they are hearing about a mechanism that still exists in different forms. The idea that social order is more important than individual truth, that certain lives must be kept discreet for the collective to feel clean. The emotional engine that makes this narrative work is not shock for shock's sake. It's the slow recognition of betrayal. A teenager expects mistakes to bring consequences, but she does not expect the entire adult world to close ranks against her personhood. She does not expect the solution to be disappearance, so the story grips because it is personal and systemic at the same time. You can feel the girl's fear in your chest, and you can see the machinery above her like a ceiling lowering, not with chains and guards, but with phone calls, signatures, policies, and tasteful phrases that hide the blade. And because you can see it, you begin to ask the question that moral panics hate most. If a society can do this while calling itself respectable, what else has it done under that same banner, and what might it still be doing now? Quietly, to people who are inconvenient to its image. In the years that followed, some of those teenagers grew into adults who could pass on the surface as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and that passing was part of the tragedy because it confirmed for the system that the method worked. If you looked only at statistics, you could be reassured. Fewer scandals, fewer illegitimate births recorded in the wrong columns, fewer disruptions to the image of an orderly nation. But statistics rarely measure what matters most. They do not capture the sleepless nights when a woman lies awake wondering where her child is, if they are safe, if they have been told anything about her beyond a sentence crafted by someone else. They do not measure the way a person flinches when a casual conversation turns to adoption or teenage pregnancy, and everyone in the room speaks freely, not knowing they are talking across a wound. They do not record the way silence passes from one generation to the next, as daughters sense there is something unspoken in their mother's past, a hesitation when certain years are mentioned, a sadness that appears and disappears like a shadow when babies are born in the wider family. The state's secret becomes a family's ghost, and ghosts of that kind don't need to be seen to shape behavior. They whisper in decisions about trust, about honesty, about whether it is safe to tell anyone you are in trouble. For some, the experience hardened into a resolve. Never let this happen to anyone else. They became campaigners, quiet at first, then louder as the culture shifted just enough to allow the word injustice, where before there was only sacrifice. For others, the experience remained something folded carefully away, because taking it out would mean reliving not only the loss, but the complicity of those who claimed to love them. It is one thing to face the coldness of a system. It is another to face the memory of a parent signing a form, a teacher looking away, a priest urging repentance instead of protection. That complexity is one reason these stories were suppressed for so long. They implicate not only faceless institutions, but cherished roles. They ask awkward questions. What does it mean to be a good mother if you send your daughter away? What does it mean to be a good father if you prioritize the family's name over your child's pain? What does it mean to be a good Christian if your theology is used to justify secrecy rather than confession? In a moral panic, the labels good and bad get twisted until they describe conformity, not compassion. To resist the system often meant being labeled selfish, disobedient, ungrateful, even dangerous. And very few people are equipped at 15 or 16 to carry that kind of condemnation, especially when it comes from the very people they rely on for survival. So most didn't resist. Or if they did, their resistance was brief, flickering out under pressure. That isn't proof they agreed. It's proof the design worked. The state's role in all this was not always a central puppet master, but it was a willing collaborator. Laws and policies gave cover to practices that already existed socially. Welfare agencies developed categories and protocols that sorted girls into neat boxes. Health services adopted procedures that standardized what might once have been individual moral choices. Education authorities prioritized institutional smoothness over personal disruption. Each file, each meeting, each recommendation contributed to something larger, a landscape in which hiding a pregnancy and separating a girl from her child could be framed as responsible governance. The idea of the problem girl emerged in official language, a phrase that transformed a frightened teenager into a risk profile. Once labeled a problem, anything that removed her from immediate view could be cast as a solution. If she disappeared into a home, the local figures of authority could mark the situation as resolved. If she returned and behaved, they could congratulate themselves on success. At no point was the question asked in any systematic way. What do these practices do to a person's long-term sense of self, of safety, of belonging? It is tempting, when looking back, to comfort ourselves with the thought that people simply did not know any better. But many did know, even then, that something was wrong. You can hear it in the fragments of testimony that slipped through, the occasional doctor or midwife who quietly encouraged a girl to ask questions, the rare parent who defied the expected script and refused to surrender their child, the scattered newspaper stories that hinted at abuses in certain homes, the murmurs of dissent in social work reports. Those voices were often marginal, drowned out by the larger chorus of "this is how it's done." Moral panic doesn't erase conscience completely. It muffles it until those who feel uneasy begin to doubt their own judgment. They tell themselves they are being sentimental, unrealistic, naive, because everyone else seems to accept the arrangement. And so the machine continues, powered not only by fear, but by a distorted sense of practicality. It's practical to avoid scandal. It's practical to keep the community calm. It's practical to provide babies to couples deemed more suitable. It's practical to expect a girl to start over, and easier not to ask how someone actually does that after being told their love is a liability. When these histories finally begin to surface publicly, decades later, they do so in a world that has shifted just enough to offer them a hearing. Investigative journalism, survivor memoirs, changing attitudes to mental health and trauma, legal challenges to sealed records, all of these pry open the old cupboards where the state's secrets were stored. And what emerges is not a neat scandal with a single villain, but a long, tangled mosaic of stories that have one thing in common. Institutions repeatedly valued their own cleanliness over the messy truth of human experience. For viewers today, especially in places like Britain, where the myth of fairness and understatement runs deep, there is something uniquely unsettling about seeing how that understated culture could be used to hide extraordinary cruelty. This is why a title like How Moral Panic Turned Pregnant Teenagers into State Secrets cuts so deep. It names the pattern. It frames the story not as an unfortunate chapter, but as a deliberate strategy, whether or not it was formally written down. It invites the audience to ask themselves an uncomfortable question. If this is what happened to pregnant teenagers, then who are the state's secrets now? Who is being managed, contained, and quietly removed from view in the name of stability, decency, or security? The answer will not be identical, but the logic may be closer than we like to think. And that is the real power of dark history when it is told honestly. It isn't about wallowing in misery or weaponizing trauma. It is about drawing the line from past mechanisms of control to present temptations. It is about taking stories that were once treated as private shame and restoring them as public evidence of how power behaves when it is allowed to operate without scrutiny. By the time a society starts calling silence protection, it has usually forgotten the difference between safeguarding a person and safeguarding an image, and that confusion is where the real damage hides. What happened to pregnant teenagers in Britain under waves of moral panic was not only a private tragedy repeated in thousands of bedrooms and backrooms, it was a lesson in how a modern country can use ordinary systems to produce extraordinary erasure. It didn't require a single law that declared girls illegal, nor a secret police dragging them through the streets. It required something far more common and therefore more frightening: A shared agreement that certain kinds of truth were too inconvenient to be seen. Once that agreement exists, a whole culture begins to behave like a machine that runs on discretion. Families learn the script and pass it down as common sense. Schools learn how to remove problems without saying the word problem. Professionals learn to frame pressure as guidance. Bureaucracy learns to translate pain into tidy phrases that sound neutral and responsible. Files are written so that the official record contains everything except the emotional reality, meaning that decades later, when someone tries to prove what was done to them, the paper itself can shrug. That shrug is a form of power. It says, politely, we did nothing wrong because the wrongness has been scrubbed out of the language. And in the middle of that, the girl herself is taught to shrink. She is taught that her body is not her own story. It is a social event that must be managed by adults who are anxious about reputation. She is taught that the most intense love and fear she has ever felt must be kept quiet so that other people can stay comfortable. She is explained to, arranged, moved, advised, and finally asked to disappear in a way that looks voluntary on paper. When the public story is very clean, the private cost has to go somewhere, and it goes into her long life, into the years that follow, into the way she learns to trust or not trust, into the way she hears the word care, and wonders whether it is just another word for control. That is why these stories land so heavily now. Not because modern audiences simply enjoy darkness, but because they recognize the pattern without having to be taught it. They have seen, in other contexts, how institutions can make damaging choices while insisting they are being reasonable, how "for your own good" can become a weapon when the person being helped is not allowed to disagree. They have also seen how communities can outsource cruelty to procedure. When you hand power to a system and then forbid the system from feeling shame, the system will always choose the path that protects itself. That is the hidden engine of so many respectable disasters. The preservation of institutional innocence. The most unsettling part is that the people involved often did not wake up thinking they were villains. A parent thought they were saving their child from lifelong stigma. A head teacher thought they were preserving order. A GP thought they were preventing panic. A social worker thought they were securing stability. A couple longing for a child thought they were creating a family. Those motives can be real and still become part of harm when the central person in the story is treated as a problem rather than a human being. Moral panic turns the vulnerable into symbols. A pregnant teenager becomes a symbol of decay, of temptation, of failure, of community embarrassment. Once she's a symbol, it becomes easier to justify decisions that would feel monstrous if aimed at a named, complicated person with a voice. That is the step where the machine crosses from misguided to brutal when it stops listening. Because once you stop listening, you can do anything while calling it care, and the victim will be told she is immature for protesting. Decades later, as Britain slowly changed and the moral language softened as sex education improved, as single parenthood stopped being treated as a stain in the same way, the residue of that older world remained in records, in sealed files, in the searching eyes of adults who never stopped wondering what became of a child they were told to forget. Some people did find their way back to truth through reunions and archives, through advocacy and court decisions, through persistent questions that finally met a crack in the wall. Others never did, and that too is part of the story. A society can steal not only a moment but a lifetime of answers. The moral panic ends, but the consequences don't end neatly. They stretch into the present in quiet ways, shaping how people think about authority, privacy, and shame. And if there is a warning in this history, it isn't that the past was uniquely cruel. It's that the past was familiar. It looked like mums and dads, and respectable professionals and reassuring voices. It looked like tidy buildings and polite conversations, and the soft pressure of everyone will be happier this way. It looked like normal life continuing, uninterrupted, precisely because the suffering had been moved out of sight. That is what you should hold on to when the story ends. Not the period detail, Not the old-fashioned language, but the mechanism. A society panics about morality, chooses concealment, builds procedures to enforce concealment, and then congratulates itself on being orderly while the hidden carry the cost. If you want to measure the morality of a system, notice who it asks to disappear. Notice whose pain it treats as inconvenient. Notice whose truths it locks away for privacy while protecting the comfort of the powerful. The point is not to despair and assume the machine always wins. The point is to recognize the moment the machine starts being built, because it is built from ordinary choices. A community can decide to meet vulnerability with support instead of shame. Schools can prioritize safeguarding over image. Professionals can treat teenagers as people with rights instead of problems with procedures. States can open records and face what was done in their name. None of those acts are glamorous, but they are how you stop a moral panic from becoming policy. And if you felt a cold anger listening to this, don't waste it on spectacle. Use it the way history demands, by refusing to let the victims vanish a second time through forgetting. If you want more stories about quiet systems that became engines of harm, stay here, and if this one has stayed with you, leave a comment with a single word, remember, and pass it on to someone who still believes respectability is the same thing as goodness.